Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on SMS techniques for monitoring operations and maintenance procedures. My name is Andy Lofton, and I'm a contractor supporting FTA's Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, or PTASP, Technical Assistance Center. Joining me for today's webinar is Stuart Mader from FTA's Office of Transit Safety and Oversight, or TSO. And Stuart leads up the PTASP Technical Assistance Center efforts for FTA's Office of Safety and Oversight. We're also joined by Shauna Miller, who's a Grants and Contracts Officer with the Idaho Transportation Department's Public Transportation Office. And Shauna is going to share some experience with all of us later in today's webinar. Now, before we get started, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, throughout today's webinar, we do want to encourage engagement. If you have any questions about what you're hearing, the content you're seeing, please feel free to ask those questions using the Q&A function in your Zoom application. We actually have a couple specialists standing by who are queuing up all of the questions that come in throughout the presentation, and we've set aside time at the end to walk through all the questions that we've received. And for those of you who are familiar with previous PTASP TAC webinars, I'm sure you already know this, but all of the materials for today, so the presentation, as well as recordings of the actual webinar, a recording, will be made available for download on the PTASP Technical Assistance Center's resource library. Now, typically those materials are posted within a couple of days. So definitely by the beginning of next week, you should be able to download the materials. And with that, let's get started. So our objectives for today, got a few things. Number one, we want to explain how monitoring operations and maintenance procedures can help verify that your transit agency's procedures are being followed and that they work as expected. Number two, we want to identify data and information that's generated by monitoring our procedures and demonstrate how this information could be used to support your safety management system, or your SMS. And finally, we want to explain how monitoring procedures can help support our efforts to manage our agency's overall safety risk. And we're going to start off our webinar first with a review of the PTASP requirements for monitoring compliance with operations and maintenance procedures and for monitoring the sufficiency of operations and maintenance procedures. Next, we're going to provide some examples about how transit agencies actually address these requirements as part of their SMS. And then we're going to get to the good part. We're going to hear from our guest speaker, Shauna Miller, to share her experience about coordinating with transit agencies and developing processes for monitoring compliance with procedures and sufficiency of procedures. And then, as we always do in our PTASP TAC webinars, we're going to end our session with a question and answer period. And so again, any questions that you have, please feel free to ask them through that Q&A pod. Now, one note that we do want to make is that we understand some of you may have questions about the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as last week's Dear Colleague letter that was distributed to industry. For questions related to that topic, we encourage you to sign up for FTA's bipartisan infrastructure law webinar. And that's scheduled for Tuesday, March 1st. And you can check out FTA's bipartisan infrastructure law webpage. The link is also provided on the screen here. And feel free, for questions about the bipartisan infrastructure law, feel free to contact this email address, fta-iija@dot.gov. And they'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. So with that, let's get started. Now, when we talk about PTASP requirements, we always find a great place to start is to talk about where the requirement sits within our SMS framework. And just as a quick reminder, the PTASP regulation establishes requirements for a safety management system, or an SMS. And that includes safety management policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. Those 4 components of an SMS. Now, our topic today is about monitoring operations and maintenance procedures. And this activity sits within the component of safety assurance, or the bottom blue arrow in this image. So let's look at our requirement. And again, this is from part 673.27B1. So monitoring operations and maintenance procedures is one of the required safety performance monitoring and measurement activities under the safety assurance element of your safety management system. And the PTASP regulation requires transit agencies to monitor their system for compliance with and sufficiency of the agency's procedures for operations and maintenance. That's the requirement. So let's start with the basics. First of all, when we think about that requirement, what are our procedures? Right? That might seem like an easy question, but let's talk about it. So in this context, we can think of procedures as including rules, policies, SOPs, practices that we carry out at our agency, and actual requirements that we have to follow. They could, I think, include things like specific traffic laws or other requirements that are imposed by federal, state, or local authorities. Now, while some procedures may just explain or document specifically how we do things at our agency, other procedures are designed to address specific safety risk and may reflect the agency's assessment regarding how work should be performed safely or how passenger service should be provided safely. Now, while they may not have been formally identified as such, we can really consider procedures as safety risk mitigations. Now, let's think about that. So an example, something like a speed restriction for buses approaching an intersection or a stop, or a procedure that establishes specific following distances. So these procedures, in effect, are in place to help reduce the likelihood and the severity of potential negative consequences, things like accidents, injuries, and property damage. Right? So we can think about procedures as serving as a safety risk mitigation. Now, as we probably all know from our previous SMS training, as a safety risk mitigation, procedures often are just not as effective as things like engineered changes. So for example, let's say we can require compliance with a speed limit through a written procedure, but that is not as effective as actually physically limiting vehicle speed through a mechanical governor on the vehicle or a train control system, for example. So because procedures are easier to bypass or violate than some engineered protections, that makes monitoring them particularly important. Because if our procedures are not being implemented the way we intended them to be, the way that we drew them up, or if they're not working out the way that we thought they were going to work out, then it might mean that the safety risk that they were originally established to address may still exist, unmitigated in our system. So at the end of the day, monitoring compliance with our operating and maintenance procedures and monitoring the sufficiency of those operations and maintenance procedures provides our agency with reasonable assurance that our established procedures are A, being followed, and that they're effective in addressing our agency's safety goals. All right, so let's go back to the requirement. And let's focus on the first component. The regulation requires transit agencies to monitor their system for compliance with procedures for operations and maintenance. Well, what do we mean by compliance monitoring? Compliance monitoring is what helps us answer this question. Does our agency carry out our procedures as they are written? And from our earlier discussions, we know that procedures help us control safety risk. So monitoring helps us identify those situations where our safety risk may not be addressed the way that we intended. Non-compliance and practical drift, things that can often be identified through compliance monitoring, can be an indicator for our agency that we may need to take further action to address safety risk. For example, through compliance monitoring, an agency may find that individuals are not following a procedure. And as a result, the procedure may not actually be addressing the safety risk that it was designed to cover. Therefore, additional mitigation may be necessary. Now, when we talk about compliance, it's a heavy word, and it's important to note that agencies may define compliance thresholds to help guide their risk management decisions. And this is important because compliance may not always be at 100%. So at some point, an agency may look at its compliance percentage and realize that that figure is simply not sufficient to address the safety risk that this procedure is addressing. An agency may be able to take action to improve compliance to a level that it believes then sufficiently addresses that associated safety risk. And also another consideration is that agencies may want to think about this compliance tolerance as it relates to different procedures. For example, the level of concern and attention that an agency may apply on compliance with a procedure related to uniform requirements or vehicle cleanliness may differ from how it handles compliance with other types of requirements, such as posted speed limits or safe following distances. Remember that information from our compliance monitoring ultimately will serve to help our agency better be able to manage its safety risk. Okay, so what about the other half of the requirement? We talked about monitoring for compliance with our procedures, but the other half requires transit agencies to monitor their system for the sufficiency of these operations and maintenance procedures. So monitoring the sufficiency of our operations and maintenance procedures would help your agency answer this question. Do our procedures successfully ensure their intended outcome? Right? Are they doing what we designed them to do? So monitoring the sufficiency of our procedures helps determine whether our procedures, even when carried out perfectly, are effective in addressing the safety risks that they were intended to address. Results from monitoring sufficiency may indicate that the agency hasn't successfully addressed its safety risk, and it may identify a need to conduct a new or revise an existing safety risk assessment. And that in turn may result in an additional mitigation, which could be a new procedure or a modified procedure. So for example, if you have a procedure in a maintenance facility related to using a metal press, but you observe that you're still getting a number of close calls related to use of this technology, the agency may decide to implement a new mitigation. Let's say installing additional guards that provide extra protection to workers when they're using the equipment. Or perhaps monitoring for sufficiency may reveal that the agency has drifted away from how it followed the original procedure, but that the activities that are being carried out by the workers are even more effective than what was written in the procedure. And so perhaps the agency finds that those actual practices in place that are used for handling and moving materials around the metal press significantly reduce safety risk and goes to update its procedure to reflect these practices. These are outcomes of sufficiency monitoring. So where does monitoring procedures sit within the rest of the SMS? Now, don't forget that the core function of an SMS, as I believe I've said a few times already, is to manage safety risk. And since our procedures themselves are one way that our agency manages its safety risk, monitoring these activities help you to support the overall SMS. It helps the agency determine whether the system is acting as we designed it and acting as we intended it to be carried out. And therefore, whether we're managing our safety risk as we intended. And it helps agencies identify areas where procedures may be falling short and where they may not be successfully managing their safety risk, and where those areas should be addressed potentially through a different SMS process. And also, something that we do want to underscore is that it's really important to remember that monitoring our procedures, these activities, really generate a lot of information. And this information can be very useful supporting the other elements of our SMS. And later in our presentation, we're going to go over some examples of some real examples of how data outputs from our monitoring can support other elements of our SMS. So now that I've covered the context of procedure monitoring within SMS, let's take a look at what it might look like in practice. And don't forget that your agency safety plan identifies, or maybe it references a separate document of the activities for monitoring operations and maintenance procedures. And it's also important to remember that your agency likely already conducts many monitoring activities. You may just not call them monitoring activities. So for example, maybe your maintenance department conducts supervisory inspections. Maybe those inspections include data points that could help indicate whether or not procedures are being followed and whether or not those procedures are sufficient. And also, please don't forget that, like the other required safety management system processes, compliance and sufficiency monitoring programs, they have to be documented. There's record-keeping requirements for all of these SMS activities. So like the rest, compliance and sufficiency monitoring programs, they have to be documented, and that documentation must be maintained for at least 3 years. Next, we want to take a moment to go over what we think is a really important distinction. When we talk about monitoring procedures, we very often quickly begin talking about activities like observations and ride-alongs and other activities that really involve watching an individual do their job, right? Observe an individual conducting a specific job task. So while we're doing that, it's important to keep in mind that monitoring procedures is intended to confirm that our agency is implementing its procedures as it intended, and that those procedures are sufficient. So that is to say that an organizational view of risk management to support organization-wide assessment. So while a single data point may come from observations of an individual, the real purpose behind monitoring our procedures is really not to grade an individual. That's not the outcome, the final outcome we're looking for. Instead, by combining all of those single data points from multiple individuals, it can help us identify the reasons why a procedure is not being carried out as written, or the reason why a procedure cannot be carried out as written, and to identify other issues related to that procedure, perhaps things tied to training or other elements within the organization. Now, of course, this does not mean that agencies don't take action if an individual's performance violates the agency's procedures. For example, if an agency performs a ride-along and the operator violates a safety rule, the agency may take individual action to address that violation. Now, this individual action is separate from the activities that the agency may undertake related to its overall monitoring for compliance and sufficiency. Now let's look at some example elements of a procedure monitoring program. So to address the requirements in the regulation, your agency, either documented in its ASP or in referenced policies and procedures, may establish monitoring activities, right? So establish define these types of observations, operational testing, inspections, audits that it's going to perform as part of the monitoring program. It may define specific frequencies and schedules for the monitoring, develop specific training for the supervisors, managers, and other personnel that interact with the process on how to actually carry out the monitoring. Also, it may identify methods for collecting and compiling the outputs from these monitoring activities in order to support the agency's full safety management system. Your agency may also develop specific criteria for how it documents, how it reports out and resolves instances of non-compliance that are observed. It may develop guidance or even, as we discussed earlier, specific thresholds for when non-compliance related to safety concerns or hazards may need to be evaluated through your formal safety risk management process. Your agency may also establish processes for analyzing non-compliance and monitoring the results to ensure that your procedures are sufficient in addressing your agency's safety risk. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take an example activity and we're going to dig a little bit deeper to see how the act of monitoring generates information and generates specific data that the agency can use in other SMS processes to help control and address safety risk. Now, for our example, we're going to focus on compliance monitoring. We have compliance and sufficiency, but just for our example, we're going to look at compliance monitoring, and specifically, we're going to look at compliance monitoring for bus operations procedures. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some techniques for monitoring compliance with bus operations procedures. And these techniques we didn't just make up. One of the functions of the PTAS Technical Assistance Center is to perform voluntary reviews of agency safety plans that are submitted from transit agencies that are looking for feedback and comment on what they've developed. And so some of these examples and the context we're going to be sharing with you are things that agencies shared with us, their processes and their techniques that agencies have defined in their agency safety plans. So let's get started. Before I get rolling in the actual examples, I do want to recognize, and I mentioned this earlier, that the goal of compliance monitoring in the context of SMS is it's not a program to catch an operator violating a procedure. The purpose here, the bigger purpose, is to collect information to help our organization be able to more effectively manage safety risk. And there are numerous opportunities to build activities into our compliance monitoring processes that ultimately support operators in performing their responsibilities. We're thinking about things like coaching, about things like reward programs and positive recognition frameworks, things like training and opportunities to reinforce compliant behavior. Now, whatever the size of the transit agency, monitoring for compliance and sufficiency of operating and maintenance procedures can be a source of organizational learning and improvement. Right? As more and more data is collected and analyzed, it can provide a much stronger understanding of really how we're operating and where the most significant safety risk is from non-compliance or insufficiency. And it's also important to acknowledge the challenges of monitoring transit operations for compliance with procedures. Why is that? Well, most bus operators work alone. And most of their driving behaviors, including compliance with transit agency procedures, may not be directly observable to the transit agency, depending on the monitoring techniques available to that transit agency. So many agencies must use monitoring techniques that sample the operator's performance to try to understand compliance with procedures. But let's get into some of the most common techniques that we observed from agency safety plans. And here are 4 of the most common. We're going to walk through each one of these 4. We're going to highlight some considerations to think about and what we saw in the agency safety plans. And then we're going to talk about how data collected from this technique not only supports the monitoring of compliance with procedures, but also supports other SMS processes. All right, so our first one is Supervisor Ride evaluations. So to address the procedure compliance monitoring requirements, most of the ASPs reviewed indicate that transit supervisors conduct ride evaluations or ride-alongs to observe operators and to support operator evaluation and training. So ride evaluations provide a great opportunity for one-on-one interaction between bus operators and transit supervisors. Now, during these evaluations, supervisors are providing firsthand observation of the operator's driving habits, and they're providing immediate feedback. There can be immediate verbal feedback and written feedback regarding compliance with the agency's procedures. So ride evaluations are designed to really uncover and to point out unsafe practices, as well as to give positive reinforcement for safe driving practices. So ride evaluations, they may be scheduled to occur throughout the course of a year as part of operations monitoring for all operators. They could also occur in response to specific concerns, maybe safety events or customer complaints, or previously documented safety rule violations. Ride evaluations also can be used when an operator is learning a new aspect, perhaps a new route, or receiving other types of instruction from the agency. And agencies typically document the results of ride evaluations on forms or sometimes directly into mobile applications that allow them to track the information for analysis and reporting out. Now, ride evaluations can identify issues, obviously, in complying with operating procedures. And in aggregate, they can really help establish a picture of how the agency provides service. Now, there obviously are going to be some challenges, as with any approach. Number one is, and you all may have experience with this, but supervisors may have many responsibilities, and maintaining a focus on ride evaluations may be difficult for some supervisors in some organizations. And also, since operators know that the supervisor is there, they may not always reveal true day-to-day driving behaviors. And also, ride-alongs may occur infrequently for one individual operator, maybe once a month or once a quarter, which may end up providing an incomplete picture of an operator's day-to-day performance. So let's look at an example. We want to see how data collected through supervisor ride evaluations can really help an agency support not only the compliance monitoring efforts, but other SMS processes. So here we have an example. Transit supervisors monitoring fixed route service for a large bus agency. And they use a mobile application to document their observations. And they're documenting things like how well traffic laws are followed. And they're ensuring that the safe driving practices and the procedures established by the agency are being complied with by the operator. Looking at things like usage of the seatbelt, obeying speed limits, stopping at stop signs and lights, using turn signals appropriately, navigating through intersections, proper following distance. Supervisors also are observing how transit operators are using their radios and how they use mobile data terminals to manage communication with the operations control center. How well they're counting passengers and receiving routing information and updates. And so all this, in our example, all this information is trended, it's tracked on a monthly basis. And when reviewed in aggregate, show a very high level of overall compliance. Monthly reports reviewed over the last 6 months, however, in this example, show an increase in instances of improper use of radio. And this comes from examples where employees are transmitting unnecessary or irrelevant or unidentified personal communication over the radio, of course, out of compliance with the agency procedures and FCC requirements. These additional communications obviously can overtax the radio system, and they could slow down controller responsiveness to other operators, and ultimately could make it more difficult to follow appropriate radio protocol in an emergency. So transit operations shared this information at a monthly SMS committee meeting as defined in their ASP. And after a brief discussion among the committee members, the training department was tasked with developing a new training campaign with a flyer and a short video for bus operators on proper use of their radio. And every bus operator was required to review the flyer, watch the video. So following that, subsequent monthly trends from the Supervisor Ride evaluations showed a reduction in observed instances of improper use of the radio. Next, the agency added this training campaign, I should say incorporated it into the agency's training program. So it became a part of the initial training for bus operators and part of the refresher training. So in this very simple example, we can easily see the connection between monitoring compliance with procedures in safety assurance, and also some clear examples of interface with our safety promotion component, things like training and agency-wide communication. All right, so we can see how these can support other aspects of our safety management system. Let's look at our next example technique that we saw in agency safety plans, and this was rule checks and random observations. And we saw this in many agency safety plans. And we saw that these rule checks, random observations may be performed by supervisors, safety personnel, or other ops personnel to monitor compliance with specific rules. So we can think of things like speeding at overpasses, specific requirements for stopping at intersections, and things like seatbelt use we saw quite a bit of. And transit observers may follow another, instead of thinking about the idea where we're sitting in the vehicle with the operator, transit observers may also use a practice that we saw where you follow the transit vehicle in another vehicle. And by following another vehicle, they can check for compliance with other aspects of procedures, requirements related to posted speed limits, recommended following distances, different perspective on how intersections are navigated, how stops are navigated, looking at things like lane changes and curbing practices at bus stops. And so these types of checks can provide really valuable detailed information on, again, the agency's overall compliance with its rules. They really can complement supervisor ride evaluations and other compliance monitoring activities an agency may leverage. Data collected through ride checks and observations give detailed information about how an agency is implementing a specific procedure, or about how they're operating through a specific location or a certain circumstance. And as a result, rule checks are an ideal tool to support other safety assurance activities. For example, like identifying safety risk mitigations that may be ineffective, inappropriate, or that haven't been implemented as intended. So in our example for this technique, we've got a transit agency that's experienced an increase in brake failures over the last year. Now, while there have been no serious accidents, the potential is there. And removing these vehicles from service after braking failures can be disruptive to operations. So while the bus maintenance department is investigating the mechanical cause of these failures, the transit supervisors decide to observe the performance of bus brake tests performed by operators during pullout. Now, the tests were designed as one way that the agency could determine if the brakes are in good operating condition before the vehicle leaves the agency's parking lot. So for the tests, the idea is the bus operator is required to move the bus forward at 5 miles an hour and then firmly apply the brakes. The operator shouldn't know any significant pull of the steering wheel. And then the test is required. The operator has to do this before leaving the bus parking area. And the agency's procedures clarify that under no circumstances should a bus be placed in service or continue in service if the brakes are not in good operating condition. Agency also requires a related test of the parking brake. Operator gently presses on the accelerator with the bus in gear, and the parking brake should hold the bus. But if it doesn't, vehicle shouldn't leave the lot. So the supervisors and operations managers observed morning and afternoon pullout in the lot. And they observed that operators generally were not taking the time to fully perform these tests, and that the pullout period was compressed. So follow-up interviews with the operators revealed some concerns. And the concerns were related to having enough time during pullout to actually complete the test. There were concerns, there was worry over making pullout requirements for service every day, in the sense that the bus had to be in really bad shape if it was going to be pulled. And there was also concern that an issue raised by operator that as a result of the bus brake test, that ultimately it would be overruled by management and the bus would be put back in service anyway. So as a result of these checks, the agency learned that the procedure, a critical mitigation designed to keep buses with poorly performing brake systems off the road, was not being implemented as intended. And that there were challenging operational, organizational, and cultural forces that would need to be addressed in order to ensure compliance with these testing requirements. So in this example, rule checks are helping to support other safety assurance activities. They're helping to identify safety risk mitigations that may be ineffective, they may be inappropriate, or they may not be being implemented as intended. Our next technique is observations from undercover riders. Now, many transit agencies experience staffing shortages and experience lean staffed environments that really can make it tough to free up supervisors to focus fully on compliance monitoring activities. So in addition, many agencies could find it beneficial to have observations from the passenger perspective. So as explained in some of the ASPs that we reviewed, agencies use undercover riders. And these individuals might be paid contractors, could be volunteers. But what they do is they help the agency observe the system. Sometimes they're referred to as ghost riders or mystery riders, but what they do is they conduct random, disguised surveillance of operations. And the riders don't end up focusing on the same types of issues that a transit supervisor may focus on and observe. The observations from this group often focus more on passenger-related concerns, things like conditions at a bus stop or customer interactions with bus operators, things like the cleanliness of the bus, on-time performance, these types of passenger-focused concerns. Now, these observations also can be tailored to address a specific agency need or a specific requirement for an agency, things like signage or route information, ADA compliance. Typically, results are documented in monthly or quarterly or annual reports that are delivered to transit operations managers. Now, while this practice supports a fuller picture of transit operations, particularly from the passenger perspective, it can be difficult for these riders to observe all aspects of operations and rule compliance. It also can be time and resource intensive. Let's look at an example. So data collected through these types of observations may provide important insights on compliance with operating procedures, including how operators are managing their stops, on how they're managing boarding and alighting, and on the condition of stops and vehicles. So in our example, data collected from an annual assessment completed by undercover riders, some of whom are also from members of the disability community, focused on how the agency manages key ADA requirements, such as calling out bus stops, managing questions on routes and priority seating, on wheelchair securement, and on operating of bus lifts, in order to help the agency identify potential safety issues or concerns that may affect its passengers. Now, the report that was submitted to the operations department from the undercover riders was shared with the safety department. And among other findings, the report identified several locations where lift deployment was particularly challenging due to the actual configuration of the bus stop. In other situations where detours and construction related to route changes, but the stop and route identification announcements weren't made. And so the safety department decides that the observations described in the report need to be addressed through the safety risk management process. And so the department identifies the hazards and the associated potential consequences and conducts a safety risk assessment. They look at the likelihood and the severity of potential consequences. They go through that SRM process, and they end up recommending additional mitigations that are focused on moving several bus stops for easier and safer deployment of the wheelchair lift. They also pursued upgrades to the automatic system that supports visual and auditory announcements about the upcoming stops and the route identification in order to allow for more customization in how the agency manages its detours. Now, the agency decided to adopt these recommendations and is currently implementing them. So looking back at our example, this really shows us how this monitoring technique can support other SMS elements. In this example, right, we can clearly see how it drove the SRM element, right, by providing these identification of hazards and then moving that concern through safety risk assessment into safety risk mitigation. All right, now our fourth technique that we wanted to share based on reviewed ASPs. It's a cool one, right? Onboard operator monitoring system. While all of the previous approaches support transit agency efforts to address procedure monitoring requirements, in terms of SMS, we really need to recognize that these activities typically are focused on negative outcomes, and they provide infrequent and potentially limited feedback to operators. We just hear about when things go wrong, right, through those observations, typically. So as a result, some transit agencies noted in their ASPs that they've increased their ability to monitor the true day-to-day performance of its operations by integrating camera technology, event data recording, telemetry, and smart technology into their operations through onboard monitoring systems. Now, in these instances, the approach provided them with a significant amount of data regarding how each bus is operated. It provided, the technology could provide 100% coverage of bus operator performance. And it supported the technology that was part of the system, gave the transit agency the ability to monitor speed, acceleration, braking force in each of the vehicles in the fleet. And it could also, in some instances, provide video recordings of any event that was detected by the system. Some transit agencies also develop additional safety-related driving parameters that are tailored and unique for their operations. And they do this, and we saw, to monitor things like instances of eating and drinking on the vehicle, or instances of cell phone use, seatbelt use, things we've talked about a lot today, like failure to stop at intersections and unsafe departure from lanes, unsafe following distances. Also, we saw fuel efficiency, which can reflect a combination of speed selection, acceleration patterns, forward headway selection, and braking force. And this is, we saw, as a commonly used measure for operator performance. Now, these systems can also provide warnings and alerts to operators, including things like forward collision warnings, lane departure warnings, and lane change and merge warnings. They can also track headway range and closing rates, and can provide post-trip summary feedback to both the operator and the safety manager. So results from the use of this technology can help some transit agencies provide even more frequent feedback to operators regarding their compliance with specific procedures or driving behaviors in order to help address safety risk. Now, of course, these types of systems have to be purchased, they have to be maintained. Some offer extensive support for analytics and video monitoring, but of course, customization may be required depending on each application and the operational characteristics of each agency. In addition to providing active monitoring of bus operator compliance procedures, if you think about it, this is going to provide an agency with an incredibly rich source of information for supporting all other aspects of the SMS. You'd see how this would be valuable information to support training development for operations, to support communications, both of those under safety promotion, also supporting the safety risk management process and actually identifying hazards, and actually helping the safety assurance process in monitoring the effectiveness of existing mitigations. So let's look at an example. In our example, we have an agency that's leveraging this technology, an operator monitoring system. And what it's done is it's captured and analyzed risky driving events, used cameras, sensors, smart technology. And what it took all of the risky driving events for the last year, and each of those concerning behaviors is also tied to an agency procedure for safe vehicle operations, things like requirements for stops, attentiveness, and safe following distances. Now, for this particular agency, an analysis of over 10,000 risky or non-compliant events that were captured in the system for the last 12 months showed these most common behaviors. Right? They showed 26% tied to late response, instances where maybe an operator, based on camera footage, wasn't visibly distracted, but still responded late and abruptly to a readily visible risky situation ahead, typically demonstrated through hard braking or swerving. 15% related to an incomplete stop, where the operator was less than 5 miles an hour, but the vehicle did not come to a complete stop at where it should have, at a stop sign or turning right at a red light. 9% were tied to following distance, where the driver did not follow according to the agency's requirements. 6% tied to failed to stop, where they failed to stop at a stop sign and the speed remained above 5 miles an hour, and 6% tied to seatbelt usage. Now, the agency was able to, in turn, take this information and coach operators on those issues through the reports coming out of this event monitoring system, and was able to do that really shortly after the events occurred. So you don't have to wait 12 months for this. They could just turn and respond. Also, in aggregate, was able to establish campaigns that were focused on maintaining attentiveness, were focused on problem areas like appropriate requirements for stops and seatbelt use and following distance. The system also allows the agency to continue to consistently monitor performance and help the agency evaluate the effectiveness of the new mitigations that it put in place. So again, we can see how this type of technique could definitely support other aspects of the agency's safety management system. Now, these were just techniques and examples that were gathered from agency safety plans reviewed by the PTAS TAC. We did want to share a couple other really great examples of how you can monitor procedures that come from other industries. Now, the first is non-punitive self-reporting of errors. Many of you may be familiar with non-punitive self-reporting systems. They allow individuals within the agency to report errors or close calls that they experience or that they've seen occur. Sometimes they allow reporters to also report suggestions for how they can prevent similar instances in the future. Now, I imagine some of you may already be collecting this type of information through your employee safety reporting program, and that's great. Collecting this information, whether through the ESRP or through another mechanism, can be a very good way to capture experiences that your colleagues are having as they go about their day-to-day jobs. For an example of a reporting system like this, you may want to check out FAA's Aviation Safety Reporting System. There's a link on the screen for that. Now, another technique, a great opportunity for gathering information about how you're carrying out your procedures and how sufficient they are, is through peer inspections and observations. Now, peer inspection is when a colleague, and we think about this, a colleague, let's say from the same agency, who performs the same job or even a similar job, observes a coworker carrying out a specific job task. And we talked about random observations earlier and undercover riders, and both of those are great. But peer inspections or observations give you just a little bit more information because they're being conducted by the real subject matter experts, the people who carry out those procedures every day. For more information on this type of technique, we would invite you to check out the Federal Aviation Administration's Line Operations Safety Assessments. And again, the link is provided for you on the screen. So whatever approach your agency or whatever approaches your agency may take to address the requirements for monitoring compliance with your operations and maintenance procedures and monitoring the sufficiency of those procedures, here are some key things to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we're monitoring the system and not just the individual. Number two, by layering multiple monitoring techniques, we can help support a more robust assessment of compliance and of sufficiency. Number three, most agencies already collect a lot of monitoring data. So you might not need to collect more data to better understand procedure compliance and sufficiency. You might just need to analyze existing data in new or different ways. Number four, data collected from compliance and monitoring can support other SMS processes and activities. And we've seen that in all four of our examples pretty clearly. And finally, monitoring procedures helps your agency monitor and manage overall safety risk of your transit system. Now, for examples of activities that transit agencies may carry out to meet this requirement, for additional help with monitoring compliance, sufficiency of your operations and maintenance procedures, we encourage you to visit FTA's PTASP TAC resource library. And in particular, we would ask you to check out FTA's Spotlight article on this topic, as well as recordings from the previous compliance monitoring webinar. And FTA has also identified for participants some industry resources that you might find useful. We do want to put a caveat on this. Note that these resources are really being provided just for general information purposes only. These documents may include recommendations for activities that go beyond FTA's PTASP requirements, and your agency is not required to use those recommendations in your program. Anyway, these resources are improving safety-related rules compliance in the public transportation industry, and successful practices and training initiatives to reduce accidents and incidents at transit agencies. Both of those are provided by the Transportation Research Board, TRB. And the third item is rule compliance program requirements. And this comes from APTA. Again, resources provided as a source of information. They don't establish or define any new requirements that go above and beyond FTA's PTASP requirements. So with that, I think we've all heard enough from me on requirements related to monitoring operations and maintenance procedures. And now we'd like to hear from a transit industry representative about her experiences. And today's guest speaker is going to do just that for us. And our guest speaker today is Shauna Miller. And I want to provide a little introduction for Shauna. Since 2012, she's worked for the Public Transportation Office at the Idaho Transportation Department. And during this time, she served as a Grants and Contracts Officer for FHWA, for FTA, and state-funded grant programs. And in 2017, she received her Public Transportation Safety Certification through USDOT's FTA Office of Transit Safety and Oversight. Shauna received her bachelor degree in psychology from Boise State University with an emphasis in organizational and structural psychology. Shauna serves on numerous committees to aid in the enhancement, safety, efficiency, and innovation of public transportation. And when not dedicating her time to public transportation, Shauna loves spending time with her husband and family. Please help me welcome Shauna. And Shauna, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to share with you today. Before we jump into our monitoring efforts, I wanted to give a brief overview of Idahos Landscape. We are a bus-only state. Idaho is predominantly rural. We have one large urban area and 4 small urban areas. We have over 55 providers throughout the state and over 750 vehicles operating public transit. Throughout the state, we have fixed route, demand response, van pool, intercity services, and a voucher program. Next slide, please. We have 9 agencies impacted by the rulemaking. 2 of our small urban providers opted to write their own plan, and we assisted them with resource sharing and reviews. The other 7 agencies opted to have a state-sponsored plan. Next slide. So in the development of our ASPs, we did an extensive amount of outreach. We talked to other states, transit agencies outside of Idaho, and held provider meetings. Our mission here at ITD is your safety, your mobility, your economic opportunity. Safety is listed first because it is the top priority at ITD, regardless of whether or not it's our staff, the agencies we work with, or the traveling public. I wanted to ensure that we were carrying over the same level of commitment into the ASPs. In our outreach, I learned that a lot of agencies were going with a streamlined single state-sponsored plan for their agencies. My concern with this approach for Idaho was that each of our systems are so unique that we would lose that level of commitment I wanted to see. The last thing I wanted was to see that these plans were developed solely to check a compliance box. I wanted to ensure that our agencies had a resource that they could use and that the ASP would be a valuable tool for them. I created a baseline template and then worked with each individual agency to customize their plan to fit their operational needs. The collaboration that occurred really aided in the transition to monitoring and oversight of these plans. Next slide. So our office is comprised of a public transportation manager and 5 grants and contracts officers. We are all subject matter experts in a variety of areas. One of the areas that I'm a SME is safety oversight. The majority of the oversight responsibility of the ASP falls upon me. Having the great working relationship with our agencies and being so familiar with their plans has been really helpful for me. We've been able to integrate reporting mechanisms into our quarterly reporting program. Each of our agencies at minimum submit their ridership data and inventory information to our office on a quarterly basis. Within that report is an area to share any noteworthy safety information we should be looped in on. I will say vast majority of our agencies reach out to me in the moment and don't wait for their quarterly report. Additionally, we've been able to integrate the new oversight components into our site review program. This process starts off with 2 distinct phases. The first is a request for information similar to the RIR that we receive from FTA. And then the second phase is our on-site review. Next slide. During our desk review, we read the ASP to ensure that all required components are included. We're looking for all the supporting documents that are referenced in the ASP to make certain that all of these documents are relevant and up to date. We look to see when the board approved the document, as well as check to see that they're adhering to their review policy for all updates to the ASP. In addition, we are looking at what their communication efforts have been. Are they keeping their MPO appraised of their goals? Are they following their communication plan and training employees? How have they kept their employees up to date on changes to their plan? How are they communicating with their employees with follow-up items for reported safety concerns? We will also review their incident and accident log and look for trends and concerns. While on site, we pull sample records and we're looking for things along the lines of sign-in sheets and agendas for toolbox meetings. We look at the safety committee meeting documentation. We pull incident accident investigations as well as do employee interviews. Ultimately, though, both phases, we are trying to determine if they're following their own policies. Next slide. So during our desk review, we use a standardized checklist with all the required components. This enables our team to have a greater flexibility in who can look over their policies. It also serves as a nice checks and balance and a cross-training opportunity. While we're reviewing the agency plans, we are also building an agency-specific checklist for their on-site review. This is where we are capturing what supplemental information we would like to see, areas of concern that need follow-up, and what questions would be fruitful to ask during our employee interviews. We also have a standard checklist of questions that we ask during our interviews with employees. Some of my favorites are, when it comes to safety, what is something that your agency does that works really well? And what is something that isn't working? And what are your thoughts on how to improve that? Are there any needs that you have that we can assist with as state DOT? Are there trainings that you would like us to bring in? Is there safety equipment or PPE needs that we can assist with? We also dig into the why behind incidents, not with the intent to give them a finding, but to determine the cause. Are things happening because of practical drift? Is there a need for policy revision? How is the agency mitigating risks? Are they looping back around to make sure that they're working? Do they evaluate to ensure that no additional mitigation efforts need to be made? In addition, we have a follow-up review process. Our agencies have 30 days to close out any findings from their site review. We provide support when possible to aid them in getting back into compliance. Depending on the severity of those findings determines our closeout process. In the event that there are significant findings in the area of safety, it could trigger a full safety audit, in which case we do a more in-depth, extensive review of their safety mechanisms, policies, and processes. We will also do spot checks to make sure that all issues have been resolved and that the resolution wasn't just a temporary Band-Aid. Next slide. We collect data on all of our site review findings. We also collect data from the incident accident report logs from our agencies. We analyze this data and look for trends and opportunities. Are we seeing a lot of office-related incidents that would benefit from a safety-related class or webinar that our agencies can attend? Are we seeing issues that could be resolved by bringing in maintenance trainers? Are there issues related to vehicle design and specs? Is there an opportunity for us to facilitate resource sharing between certain agencies? We also ask our providers to share with us lessons learned and best practices. This is something that we share with other agencies to help them in areas that they may be struggling. Next slide. So now I'll share some lessons learned and tips I have from our oversight and monitoring. First and foremost, it is imperative that we are constructively leveraging our results. We need to get away from using safety oversight as a gotcha program. One of my colleagues likes to remind people that we do better when we know better. The average person does not want to intentionally cause hazards or harm others. We all want to be safe. We all want to go home every day at the end of our shift. Look for opportunities to bring in trainings to help your agencies and have the flexibility to accommodate their needs. We collaborate with all of our agencies when scheduling safety trainings to minimize barriers to frontline staff being able to attend them. I'll gladly work nights and weekends to get them the resources that they need. Our office firmly believes that it is our role to help our agencies be successful and to provide them with the tools and resources to make that happen. Safety should never be stagnant. If it is, we're not doing it right. We always need to be on the lookout for opportunities to improve and grow from our experiences. We need to have a constant flow of information to make that happen. Trust your providers and their experience. Ego has no place in safety. Your providers are out there on the ground dealing with these issues daily. Lean on them for information. Build mutually respectful relationships and keep an open line of communication. Our agencies need to be able to trust us and come to us when they need help. Be a sounding board to look at situations from different angles and perspectives. A lot of my agencies include my contact information in their ASPs, so their employees know that they're always welcome to reach out to me if they feel like they are not getting a resolution through their normal communication channels. My agencies trust that I'll tactfully approach them to discuss it with them and work on a resolution. And last but certainly not least, collaborate whenever possible. Use your results to bring in resources for your agencies to help them maintain compliance. Our office budgets safety equipment. I have an inventory of reflective triangles, seatbelt cutters, first aid kits, and bloodborne pathogen kits that are freely provided to our agencies if they need them. We utilize our CARES state admin to order large quantities of face masks and distribute them monthly to any of our agencies that need them. Help facilitate connections with other agencies. I'm a firm believer in working smarter, not harder. If there is an agency out there that has developed an innovative idea or approach, I want to help facilitate that collaboration to roll it out to other agencies. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all in this together. Next slide. I'd like to thank you guys for your time today. If you want to share some great things that are working for you, I would love to hear about them. I'd also gladly share any resources or information that would be helpful to you in your program. Feel free to reach out. My contact information is on the slide and will be included in the slide deck that FTA will be sharing.
Shauna, thank you so much. That was awesome. We really appreciate you sharing your perspective and also giving us the perspective of monitoring from the state level. It's really, really, really great information. So moving on, we're going to move towards our question and answer session momentarily. And I would like to remind everyone that you can use that Q&A pod to ask questions. Also, if you have any questions for Shauna, when you enter it into the Q&A pod, just let us know that the question's for Shauna and we can direct them to her as well. But before we get on to the questions and answers, we do want to remind everyone that FTA has a service to help you as you address PTAS related requirements. And that's the PTAS Technical Assistance Center. There's a website that has a resource library with a huge supply of technical of guidance documents and templates that you can use to help support your agency. There's also an FAQ site that obviously covers questions that we hear from the industry related to PTAS. We have a help desk where we have specialists that are responding directly to emails that you send us. And we can get answers back to you shortly if you have a specific question that you would like a response on. And that email is available at ptas-tac@dot.gov.